Turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5 now. And I want to read for today's lesson verses 10 through 12. This is the ending of the Beatitude. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And then that is the explanation, or actually the ongoing content of the last blessing, verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. When we think about persecution, it seems to be the lot of God's chosen ones, doesn't it? When we look in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, people who choose to live for God tend to suffer. So much so that the Apostle Paul reminded Timothy that all who live godly will suffer persecution. That's what he said. Now, we would prefer that it not be that way, but this blessing is a reminder. And I don't know if some of you have read Eugene Peterson's The Message. Is supposed to be a paraphrase of the New Testament. And there are times when I think it's appropriate to look at a paraphrase, especially if you're reading a tough verse or section, you're like, what in the world is this about? Sometimes a paraphrase can help you. Eugene Peterson spent a lot of his life putting together that message, and some of you may actually have a copy of it. He originally translated the message for evening devotions for his children. He wanted them to be able to understand the Bible. And what really hooked me was, I was getting ready to make a statement. This blessing that we're talking about is a reminder that the Christian life is not an easy one. And in his paraphrase, Eugene Peterson says, the Christian life is not a picnic. That kind of hooked me. Because when you say something not a picnic, what are you saying? It's not going to be easy road. There's going to be some challenges. And so this blessing reminds us of that, doesn't it? Now, the more committed that we are to God, the more persecution we're likely to experience. And there is a correlation there. We would prefer that it not be that way. Now, during this lesson, we're going to ask two questions. Who are the people in my life that are persecuting me? Because we want to make this an applicable lesson. And a second question that's even, I think, more important. Am I spiritually ready when persecution comes my way in my life? Am I ready? Can I prepare? Will I be ready? The primary reference to the context of this persecution is somewhat surprising. It's within God's covenant people. It's religious leaders against the prophets, religious leaders against Jesus, religious leaders against Jesus followers. And it's strange to think that persecution can go from God's people to God's people, but that's who he's speaking of. And it's important that we think not only of persecution, because we tend to, being from pagans or Christians. And it's much more than that. I was thinking about this. In his audience that day, Jesus is talking to individuals who have already been mistreated, persecuted, shut out by the religious leaders of his day and time. And so they're already perking their ears up, and they know what he's talking about. A few years ago, the writer William Bennett wrote a book called Tried by Fire, the first 1,000 years of Christian history. And he indicates in the book, and I couldn't believe this because he was accessing mostly what you call primary resources, but some of the most barbaric actions that Christians experienced up to the year 100 were at the hands of other Christians who disagreed with them. Now, when you read through early Christian history, yes, the Romans and other pagan nations and groups persecuted the church and did so. And many of the Roman emperors tried to stamp out Christianity. But some of the most barbaric and just shocking things were Christians against Christians. And some of it had to do with whether or not you agreed about the nature of Jesus Christ. Was Christ God, or was he just like God? And this is what is so crazy. In the Greek language, to be someone or to be like someone, that word, depending on which one you chose, was differentiated by the little letter I. And so some people have talked about how many people lost their lives all because of the little letter I. Well, it's sad to think that Satan can have an upper hand, a persecution historically in the church for Christians being barbaric toward one another. So there's been a long history of that. What this reminds me of is this passage in 1 Peter chapter 1, 6 and 7. He says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, it may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." Now that may be kind of hard for people to swallow. But notice, going through hard times, suffering grief, all kinds of trials, one thing, it's designed to prove the genuineness of your faith. And I think I've mentioned this before. In the book of James, there is a unique term that he alone uses. It's only twice in the book of James. And it's the word double-minded. And what he's trying to say is you can't sit on the fence and expect blessings from God. Well, all of a sudden, in the second and third century church father writings, they begin to use the word double-minded all over the place because persecution arose like crazy all over the Greco-Roman Empire. And as a result of that, there were a lot of Christians, people calling themselves Christian. We don't think that this is worth it. And so they would defect from the Christian faith. And so that's why this word double-minded was used an awful lot. But notice, as we're talking about persecution, suffering, going through all kinds of trials and obstacles, these have come so that they can prove the genuineness of your faith. Now, wouldn't it be nicer if we could just walk up to the Lord and say, "Lord, I don't think I want to go through that. Just trust me, my faith is genuine." No. If something is proven, it's got to go through the trials. And so if our faith is proven genuine, guess what? We live in a world where it's going to take some proving. And we prefer not, but that's the way it is. So blessed are those who are persecuted. Literally having been persecuted. So there are people standing in his audience that day, still bearing the consequences and the results of ongoing fallout from all kinds of persecution. So they're hearing this, and it's really resonating with them. So let's start off with the first question. What kind of persecution are we talking about? Let me just make an observation. It is kind of fascinating to me that the persecution he mentions, look in verse 11. "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me." Notice that the specifics is not when he comes along and says, "Well, Blessed are you when people persecute you and beat you up or feed you to the lions. I mean, obviously it would include that, but what he mentions first specifically is the kind of persecution that you feel when people are saying things about you and against you that they shouldn't. And I've thought about that this week. I thought, there's something about human nature that words probably hurt worse than stones. And we take it deeper. I mean, you can take something, somebody throwing something at you, hitting you with something, that can go away. But the words, oh my, they can go awful deep. And he knows that kind of persecution. And this is what he is talking about. So let's talk about the insults. It's going to happen. In fact, he says, whenever those insults come. And this word insult is a really important word because it has the idea of casting blame or shame upon another. And you do it in a public way because you want the worst possible effect to go on that person. So you're really out for a person's reputation, these insults. In the Greco-Roman world, honor and shame were pivotal social values, more than we can ever dream of. And to reproach someone was to challenge their honor and their social standing. So when you would insult someone in the Jewish culture, reproach was significant because it was associated with moral or religious failure. You were putting someone down because you didn't like them. And you were trying to make other people think that they were the worst despicable character on the face of the earth and something was really wrong with them. Sometimes this word reflects highlighting this kind of approach because you're out to destroy someone. I had forgotten this, but if you turn your Bibles over to the end of Matthew 27:44, this gives us a little bit of insight in the crucifixion scene. I thought this was fascinating. Turn to Matthew 27, verse 44. This is Jesus' crucifixion. People are standing at the foot of the cross. There are people shaking their heads, passing by, and they're saying, "You're going to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days? Well, save yourself and come down from the cross. You say you're from God, prove it." Well, the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders, they mocked him. He saved others. He can't even save himself. Let him come down from the cross and then we'll believe. He trusts in God, let God rescue him now if he wants. For he said, "I'm the Son of God." And then notice verse 44. In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. So not only was Jesus dying a shameful death, they were throwing public insults at him. To heap shame upon shame is what they were trying to do. So this idea of insults, I found something that was interesting, and I just hadn't really thought about this. In different cultures, if you look this up, there are different ways to heap insults on people in different cultures. And I wasn't aware of that. But a lot of people are, and they know how to really throw them out. But when you're persecuted, sometimes people will use insults and they will say all manner of evil against you. This includes outright lies, innuendos, gossip, maligning a person's motives, cursing them, wishing them some harm, and you can just go on and describe this. And that is a form of persecution, and that's very hurtful if you've ever been the recipient of it. So what are some of the other forms of persecution? He doesn't go into detail, but history has provided us a lot of ways that people are persecuted, all the way from being beaten and run out of town, stoned, beheaded, set on fire, fed to the lions. You can just go on and on and on with other forms of persecution. But like I said, it's fascinating to notice that here Jesus specifically addresses verbal and social harm. Now, as we look at this beatitude then, who promotes or instigates the persecution? Well, he uses this word people, and you're like, oh, blessed are you when people insult you. So this broad term, who might Jesus have had in mind? Within the people of God, it is usually referring to the religious leaders and those of influence. Or when you look through the Gospels, it could refer to someone who doesn't appreciate the fact that you're following Jesus, and so they become an enemy of yours and they try to disparage your reputation. In Matthew 9:34, after Jesus healed 2 blind men and a demon-possessed man, here's what the Pharisees say. But the Pharisees said, it is by prince of the demons that he drives out demons. Well, again, this was an insult that they were trying to throw out against Jesus' ministry, give it a bad reputation, and destroy what he was trying to do. This persecution is for 2 reasons. The first is righteousness. And I like this word righteousness because it conveys something that is critical. It denotes the quality of being right or just before God. And it describes a righteousness that comes from God to us through Jesus. Paul makes this distinction very clear. Unfortunately, I think in the past, what we thought about, the way we phrased it, is that righteousness means I do all the things right, and the more right I do, the more righteous I am. Well, that's not the way Paul would define it. He would say, wait a minute, if anybody could brag about being righteous, and quotation marks around righteous, he said, you can't believe my background. I would claim it with anybody. But he says, I don't have a righteousness of my own. The righteousness that I claim comes from God through Jesus Christ and his gift of what he did for me. So righteousness is a right standing before God that was accomplished at the cross, and that I respond to that gift of salvation so that my life that is lived in a righteous manner is not, how can I say it? It's not to prove to others that I'm better than they are, or that I've done something special to earn God's grace. Instead, my standing before God, I recognize it as a graceful gift. It motivates me to make the kind of choices that are right and that honor God. It's not about earning anything. Now, he goes on, not only is it for righteousness' sake, but also because of Christ. None in the audience that day knew exactly what he was talking about here. In the beginning, the intense persecution that Jesus suffered, it got to the point where all of his disciples left him. And here's the verse that I was looking at, I mentioned this morning in Bible class, Matthew 26:56. At the point of betrayal by Judas and Jesus being handed over to the officials, this is the last sad note about his disciples. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. You know why? That persecution they saw coming was because of Christ, and they were not willing to pay the price. Now, this goes back to my earlier question in the introduction. Are we ready in our life for persecution? Or when the moment comes, would we have such weak faith that we would run away like they did? This is a critical moment of discipleship in the Gospel of Matthew, that these disciples, though they had been walking with Jesus 3.5 years every single day, it came to a crucial point, and look at the wording. Not only did they just kind of go away, they deserted him and they ran. It wasn't just that they kind of quietly slipped away. They deserted him and they ran. They didn't want to get caught. They didn't want to be part of this. They were scared. They were afraid. Oh, they had lost their faith at this point. And so it's because of Christ that persecution comes. The persecuted possess the kingdom of heaven. This is a present possession. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is, notice that present, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's the foretaste of being with God forever. The blessing, part of it, can be claimed now. Now, here's the question then, what is the kingdom of heaven? For those of us here on earth, it's God's presence through Jesus. There are spiritual realities going on now. The kingdom of heaven was attempted to be depicted in various perspectives, and we'll get to this in Matthew 13, because that chapter is all about the parables and the kingdom. But it's the blessings of God's favor and his presence now. So what's the response to this persecution? Surprisingly, rejoice and be glad. Really? Is that the human response? Is that the natural response? Do you like it when you go through insults or somebody's really after you or say something that's not right and you know that they're trying to give you a bad time? Well, it is hard to rejoice and be glad. Rejoice for God's people has always been much deeper than just be happy. Now, you might not be happy that somebody is gossiping about you or saying things or even insulting you or trying to make your life as a Christian difficult. You know, may not be happy about that. But notice, we can rejoice, if we could just think about that, we could rejoice in that moment, like Peter said, if we could remember this is a moment of proving how genuine my faith is. That I'm not going to let sticks and stones and words to bruise my faith. I'm not going to let it deter me from my perseverance in following Jesus Christ. Interestingly, this is the only time in the book of Matthew that the word rejoice is ever used. It's in this context. This points out, I think, how crucial it is in the mindset of the kingdom. When we follow Jesus, he tells his disciples how to act in times of persecution. He knew it was coming, and so he wanted them to know how. This is the opposite response from human tendency. Remember when Jesus, and this kind of goes with the principle he's going to talk about, turn the other cheek when we suffer from someone. How hard is that? See, the human response is if somebody slaps you on the cheek, you want to slap them back, give them what they deserve, is our thinking. But listen to what Paul says in Philippians 4:4-9. Rejoice in the Lord always, and I'll say it again, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Let your gentleness be evident to all. If we're in an attitude of revenge and trying to get back at people when, they're promoting things coming toward us that don't feel good, I doubt that it's going to be evident that we're in a mode of gentleness toward all. That's certainly not going to be the case. But what is the blessing to be claimed from this persecution? First, he's going to say, great is your reward in heaven. The abundance and the overflowing provisions eternally. See, in heaven, this is part of the Christian life, that there's this powerful pull that we believe in heaven, being in the presence of God forever. Is kind of like a heavenly magnet. It's that reality that kind of pulls us toward God in this life. We're living in preparation for being in heaven with God forever. And it's interesting, too, that rewards are part of the Christian life. And what role do they play in a healthy spiritual life? almost one half of all the references to reward in the New Testament are found in the Gospel of Matthew. It's all over the place. Rewards are not conceived of something that you earn, rather blessings to be granted. And that may be a little hard for us to think and see it. If we only look at it in terms of how we normally talk about reward, we do something to earn a reward. Okay? Those of you who are teachers, when children are smaller in class, they do something right, they get a star on the forehead or on a sheet of paper or up on the wall. You give them a reward. Good behavior, get a reward. Well, this idea is different in the Christian life. When you're following Jesus, God is going to give you a blessing. And that blessing is because you're in covenant relationship with God. Listen to Matthew 6, verse 6. This is fascinating. But when you pray, and we'll come to this when we get to chapter 6, when you pray, go into your room or your closet, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will bless you or reward you. So when you go into prayer, you don't want it to be something that you earn or that's something that people notice and you're kind of showing off. See, when he talks about this in chapter 6, he talks about those leaders who love to pray long prayers and they love for people to hear them pray the long prayers. Well, Jesus says, no, that's not what it's about. Matthew 10:42. If anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. There's going to be a blessing for those of us who bless others. So rewards are conceived of not being earned, but blessings granted. And here's something as we get toward the end of this lesson. Persecution has always dogged the heels of God's faithful people. He mentions this phrase, the prophets who were before you. There's a long line of prophets in the Old Testament, both major and minor prophets. And these prophets left a legacy of faithful critique. I was reading just this past week out of Isaiah and looking at what Isaiah said and some of the things that he had to go through. And he says, in the same way as these prophets, you too will suffer the same thing. So what was it like for those Old Testament prophets? What did they go through? Well, when you read that whole collection of the prophets, they were persecuted by the kings in power, some of them by the elders of the country, some by the leaders, civil leaders. And part of their experience just across the board was being persecuted. David was persecuted and hounded by his enemies. One thing that's kind of fascinating when you read through the Psalms to look at how many of those Psalms were composed when David's enemies were after him. There's a lot of them. Elijah, persecuted by Jezebel, Ahab's wife. He fled because he thought he was the only one left. And Jeremiah, they fought against him and persecuted him. But the Lord promised that he would take care of him. Isaiah, the same thing. Isaiah, this is fascinating. Isaiah almost became his own source of persecution. When God called him to be a prophet, he's like, oh, woe is me. I'm not the right person. I can't say the right thing. Lord, why are you choosing me? The Lord said, don't worry about it. So he sends an angel with a hot coal, touches it on Isaiah's lips, and guess what? You're now my spokesman. Don't use your inability to persecute your own thoughts of unworthiness. And sometimes we can be our own worst persecutors that way. But this gives us an insight of what was going on in the lives of the prophets, but also some dynamics going on in the audience of Jesus. So as we bring this lesson to a close, I want to ask, how can we think about this today for ourselves? And I want to share these 7 observations. And again, as always, with the lessons that are coming out of Matthew, you may think of others to add to this. And that certainly is something that I would encourage. So this beatitude, blessed are those who are persecuted, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The more committed you are to God, the more persecution you'll experience. There's going to be more and more people not appreciate where you are in the journey that you're on. Number 2, some of the worst persecution will be what people say against you when you're trying to be and do your best for the Lord. There are going to be people, they don't care. They don't know what you're up to, and what they think they see, they don't like, and they're going to make you pay for it. Number 3, often the worst persecution comes from God's very own people. Sometimes church settings are so toxic that members persecute one another. And that's not only is that brutal, but that's where Satan gets a handle on God's people. Number 4, during times of persecution, God is with us and the kingdom of heaven is ours. We're blessed when that happens. Number 5, during times of persecution, we rejoice and are especially exceedingly glad. That one may take a while to sink in, because that's not our natural response. Number 6, our ultimate reward is great in heaven when we remain steadfast during persecution, whatever form it takes. And in the steps of the prophets, we expect opposition when we're trying to live God, live for God, and trying to spread his word, just the way it is. So I hope that this beatitude, and it is interesting that these beatitudes are given by Jesus to remind his followers that there is another way to think about things than just the natural response. And when you think that way, there are unique blessings that only the disciple of Jesus can get. Most people don't think like this on persecution. And we see it in the news all the time. One group bombs another group. Guess what? Revenge coming right back. And it's like it's never ending. And so the worldly view of how you respond to persecution, whatever form it is, it's ongoing and it'll never stop. It's people trying to pay each other back, and that never, that's a never-ending downward spiral, and that'll never stop. Only God's people can stop that, and that is a different way of thinking. Because it's going to come. It's going to come in different forms. Are we ready? And are we ready to portray the mindset of Jesus when it does?